Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Dan Healey. I am a professor of Russian and Soviet history at the University of Oxford. And this is the webinar from Critical Pedagogies to Research Practice and Public Engagement in Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies. And this session is entitled Intersectionality in Focus, New Directions in Research, Queer Studies. So these sessions are looking at the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated pre-existing institutional, structural, and systemic discrimination and inequality in societies across the world and in our region, of course, as well. And we're looking today at questions of intersectionality, which of course impact our region differently from the home regions we may be based in the West, in North America, or in Western Europe. And yet these differences between the way inequalities operate in those fields provide a rich ground for intellectual conversations in our field. And so today, as I say, we're looking at new directions in research and particularly at queer studies. And we have two papers from two scholars in the field. Our first speaker is Professor Anita Kurimay. She's Associate Professor of History at Bryn Mawr College. She received a PhD from Rutgers University and specializes in modern European history, emphasizing East Central Europe. Dr. Kurimay's primary research interests include the history of sexuality, women's and gender history, conservatism, the history of human rights, and the history of sport. Her book, Queer Budapest, 1873 to 1961, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2020, examines the precarious coexistence between various illiberal Hungarian regimes and the queer community. And she's going to be speaking to us today with remarks under the title Queering Aziz. So I'm turning over to Anita now. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you, Dan, for those very kind words, and thank you for the organizers for facilitating this conversation and the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to our discussions. So ask people outside of academia in the US or in the UK about their knowledge of East Central Europe and Russia, and the chances are that they will mention autocrats like Putin and Orban and maybe the Law and Justice Party in Poland, but it's just as likely that they would talk about the attacks on sexual minorities, abortion rights, and a few might even recall the battles over the so-called gender ideology that occurred throughout the region. Of course, issues around women's rights and rights of sexual minorities have been front and center in domestic politics within the East Central European region and Russia. Thus, it is even more ironic that while issues around gender and sexuality have been at the center in mainstream discussions within and about the region, LGBTQ+ and even gender scholarship is still largely happening on the margins of ACs. But more on that perhaps in the Q&A. For me, reflecting on the new directions within the field of LGBTQ+ scholarship must start with thinking about the conditions of working with queer subjects, history, archives, and heritage in the region, and how the very real impediments that exist condition the possibilities of scholarship. Within and outside the walls of East Central European academic institutions, homo and transphobia and sexism are very much present. The perceived association of one's intellectual subject with one's sexual and gender identity makes writing on queer subjects a challenging endeavor. And more recently, the explicit attempts to delegitimize and shut down gender studies programs and withdraw funding for projects involving LGBTQ+ subject compounds the challenges. As a historian, I also have to mention the issues of sources and the lack of archives. In contrast to most places in Western Europe and the US and elsewhere, where in the past few decades there has been a collective effort to create archives both within larger institutions, like for instance, the Human Sexuality Collection at Cornell, and also more funding dedicated to specifically LGBT community archives like for instance, in New York, the Lesbian History Archive, has been simply not the case in the ECE. There have been efforts on behalf of the LGBT communities on the ground. So just to name a few, Karol Radziewski's Queer Archive Institute in Warsaw, Valentina Jansku's at the National Art Museum of Romania, and of course the Hatté Archives in Budapest. But overall, we cannot talk about institutional support on any grand scale. Moreover, as I discovered in the case of State Socialist Hungary, there was also an effort on part of the authorities to silence and erase pre-existing histories of queer people through the destruction of archival evidence, notably the decades-old Hungarian homosexual registry, which have important consequences for researchers. So I think without necessarily romanticizing the situation of Western academics who work on queer histories, the conditions in which scholars of queer history operate in the ECE is really different from the US and UK and elsewhere. At the same time, this has, of course, not stopped scholars in the ECA from producing and working on innovative works on queer and non-normative sexualities, which brings me to actually reflect on how I see the scholarship on queer history in the ECA region. So just to provide a definition, queer history for me is locating non-normative sexualities in the past. And I don't just mean identities, but rather all forms of sexual and gender expressions that lay outside of the normative. In the context of my research, this means historicizing both queer discourses and discourses around queers, official and popular attitudes towards queers, as well as queer experiences from the late 19th century to the present. This is what we can call recovery aspect, which I think is crucial for scholars working on LGBTQ+ histories in the region, not simply for history's sake, that is, in order to reinsert sexual minorities into the history of East Central Europe, but also as a moral and an ethical responsibility, given the current political situation, not only in Hungary and the ECE more broadly, but also globally, when LGBTQ rights and visibility and gender have become politicized to an unprecedented degree. As we know, in places like Hungary and Poland, the queer communities are at the center of ongoing efforts to limit human rights, destroy democracy and democratic norms, and propagate an ultra-nationalist view steeped in heteronormativity. Within this politically weighted environment, writing LGBTQ histories has become a political act rather than simply an intellectual exercise. But recovery histories of non-normative sexualities also lead to what I call queering of histories. So having recovered non-normative sexuality and non-normative histories in the past, writing queer histories have also led to the queering of history. That is the reinsertion of non-normative sexualities into the political, social, and cultural history of the ECE. Such works have challenged long existing and established narratives about the nature of different political systems, as well as Western interpretations of East Central Europe's relationship to Europe. Thus, writing queer histories led to the rewriting of mainstream histories through the lens of sexuality and gender. So just to give you a few examples, in my own work, which focuses on Budapest, having excavated discourses about non-normative sexualities and also historicized their legal and police treatment, I could establish that Budapest had a growing homosexual subculture by the first decade of the 20th century, which continued to grow and become more visible despite Hungary's turn to a conservative authoritarian political system during the interwar era. But through inserting queer discourses and looking into contemporary state building through a lens of non-normative sexuality and gender, I could also make an argument that queers and the regulation of non-normative sexualities were at the heart of the project of Hungarian modernity. And in doing so, I could provide a narrative where queers were at the heart and center of political history throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Another example would be the scandal of two of the most visible conservative women in interwar Hungary who were charged with female homosexuality, which, while not criminalized at the time, would have served as a legitimate reason for divorce, which the husband of one of the women was pursuing. So by analyzing their trial using legal documents and contemporary press accounts, I could show how the trial created a national sex scandal, which ultimately neither damaged the women's reputation nor halted their political aspirations. Surviving records of the trial and its press coverage also make it possible to reconstruct interwar discourses on female homosexuality, which is still a rarity in queer histories, and in particularly in East Central European historiography. Revealing conservative, but the scandal is also a remarkable example of the coexistence of conservative politics and the tolerance of certain forms of queer sexuality in interwar Hungary. Revealing conservative tolerance of queer sexuality not only challenges narratives about conservatism and intolerance of queer sexualities past and present, but also highlights the calculated instrumentalization of anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric and policy that sets Fidesz, the ruling Hungarian party, apart from both interwar Hungarian conservative systems and also contemporary Western European far-right parties. But something we could perhaps talk a bit more about in the Q&A. But enough of Hungary. The results of queer histories, which have been steadily growing for the past decade, have been, I would argue, profound in creating transnational narratives and also writing histories of sexuality that place the ECE within a European and a larger global sexual historical framework. The cumulative effects of scholarship by interdisciplinary scholars on sexuality, such as Agnieszka Kościanska, Katarina Liskova, Judith Takács, Lukács Sulc, Anna Borgos, Robert Kupa, and many, many others, established that the ECE, while being intimately connected to Western trends, have had a different trajectory of queer history from the US and more generally of the Cold War West. What emerges is that during the first half of the 20th century, there were some remarkable progressive legislations, medical and popular discourses around queer sexuality in the ECE, which was part of a global paradigm shift in both defining and recognizing non-normative and in particular homosexuality as a sexual identity. For instance, we can think of the Hungarian communists decriminalizing consensual same-sex acts in 1919, and as Kamil Karszewski shows in the case of Poland, essentially decriminalizing same-sex acts as early as 1931, when most of the rest of the world continued to prosecute it. In their study of popular as well as official discourses, works on queer histories of the pre-World War II era helped to reframe long-existing East-West divide and portray a queer universe that was inherently transnational and multi-directional, where information and bodies circulated across European cities. It was the subsequent post-World War II communist or state socialist period that brought about a different trajectory for the ECE countries, whereas in the West, despite hardship and prosecution in the immediate post-war years, gay liberation movements increasingly became visible, and by the 1970s gaining political and cultural recognition, there was no such a possibility in East Central Europe until the end of the communist one-party rule, where civic society did not function nor was political organizing allowed. Moreover, as the research of Judith Takács and Katarina Liskova showed, even as homosexual relations were decriminalized in 1961, going into effect 1962 in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, mind that it is again earlier than most places in the West, decriminalization did not mean that there would be any public discourse allowed to challenge the communist pathological view on homosexuality, which continued to be dominant until the 80s. Nor importantly, were homosexuals allowed the kinds of visibility that they attained elsewhere in the West. This state socialist history becomes crucial to understanding the current situation in the ECE, why the newfound visibility and organizing of LGBTQIA+ communities are often seen as a novel, distinctly post-1989 phenomenon. The result being that nationalists can and do frame queer people as Western import and as a horrid consequence of Western liberal democracy, and ultimately claim that LGBTQI+ people are not part of the nation, but rather an aberration, without having to acknowledge why there was a little homosexual and gay visibility prior to 1989. Nationalist parties can fuel public homophobia and ultra-conservative gender norms as state agendas. At the same time, more recently, there has been innovative scholarship on the state socialist era that has shown that queer discourses continued to circulate during the state socialist era, as for instance, the case of medical IDs of Kurt Freund in both directions of the Iron Curtain. The works of Kate Davidson and Lukács Sulc also move beyond national focus and stress the complex connections across regions and cities that cut across national borders. In doing so, queer histories have been at the forefront, what I would argue, to decenter Western Europe. In closing, I believe that while there will continue to be recovery projects and new, very much needed histories of trans, gender non-conforming, and rural and small city-focused queer histories in the region, incorporating LGBTQ histories into established histories, in other words, queering ECE, will continue to offer new perspectives on long-held political, cultural, and social histories of the region. These projects will help to rethink the relationship within countries in the region, as well as reconsider and reconceptualize the region's position in the world. And that is where, for me, some of the most exciting possibilities lie in the future. Just imagine the splash if the next annual ACES convention would be titled Queering ACES, Past, Present, and Future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita. And there's going to be time for questions later in today's program. So keep your questions, make a note of your questions and put them in our Q&A boxes in the chat there. Not in the chat section, but in the Q&A section that's at the bottom of your screen. Our next speaker is Renee Perelmutter from the University of Kansas. She is associate professor of Slavic languages and literatures and Jewish studies at the University of Kansas. They received a PhD from UC Berkeley and serve as the University of Kansas Director of Jewish Studies. Dr. Perelmutter's research and teaching interests focus on morphosyntax and pragmatics of Slavic and Jewish languages, especially Russian, Hebrew, and Yiddish. Dr. Perelmutter's latest research has focused on the construction of gendered practices and identities in multi-participant discourse. And their paper today is entitled Expressing Non-Binary Gender in Russian, New Directions in Queer Linguistics Research. So I'm turning over now to Renee. Welcome, Renee. Oh, you're muted, Renee.
I'm so sorry. Am I not muted now? It's all good. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Dan, for the introduction. And thank you to all the organizers for all your hard work on making this panel happen. Thank you, Anita, for a very thought-provoking talk. I'll probably have some questions later, but without further ado, I'm going to try to share my slides and begin the talk. So one of the way this research has come into being is that I have a professional interest in how gendered identities are expressed, especially in multi-participant discourse online and in other communities. And I've been constantly asked for years now how to do non-binary gender in Russian. And so it's specifically for language practices in the classroom. So I am working on really a series of papers that are connected. This talk will focus on expressing non-binary identities in Russian, which is, as most of you very well know, is a morphologically complex language with a system of grammatical gender. Language change around the world in regards to expressing non-binary identities is ongoing right now in multiple languages. We are in a situation of rapid language change around the world because of the growing visibility of non-binary people and because of the importance and focus on LGBTQA issues. Globalization and specifically mediated environments such as online environments have contributed to LGBTQA plus discourses and specifically non-binary discourses being spread much easier around the world. So, and they reach people in countries with lesser acceptance of visibility. So people are trying to understand how to express their identities, and they can learn so not just from their native language, but also from the globalized experience of talking to people around the world. So these things become topics of discussion. The Russian sociopolitical situation, without getting too deep into it, it affects LGBTQI speakers in general, but non-binary speakers specifically. It also affects how people react and relate to what non-binary speakers might or might not be doing with the language. I'm going to give you a little bit of background how it works, not just in Russian, but basically non-binary linguistic expression and related changes will depend on specific linguistic structure. Not every language is going to do the things in the same way. Languages code grammatical gender for many reasons, many of them historical. And these historical reasons of the evolution of the morphological system of gender might no longer hold, or they might not be societally completely matching or not matching at all the ideas of gender. Some of the options for coding grammatical gender in languages, not all, but some, include languages which do not code for grammatical gender at all, such as Hungarian, which doesn't even have gender differences in the pronoun. There are languages with minimal grammatical encoding. In English, we have masculine, neuter, and feminine distinction in the pronouns mostly, although there's some other places, but mostly it's in the personal pronouns he, she, and it, which reflects, some kind of a vestiges of the late Proto-Indo-European gender system, which I'm happy to go into at some later point. And we have a system with multiple genders, such as Russian, which has masculine, feminine, and neuter throughout the grammatical system in the singular, including adjectives, nouns, verbs, pronouns. And again, this too is some kind of a descendant of the late Proto-Indo-European system, same as English, but in English, the system underwent the process of attrition. In Russian, it did not. Then there is a system with two binary genders, such as Hebrew or, for example, Arabic, where you have masculine and feminine throughout the system, verbs, nouns, adjectives, etc., pronouns, in the singular and in the plural. I have another big research project about Hebrew, and things are being done very differently, and this is really interesting. This is an area of ongoing change and fluctuation, and internet and social media are sites of linguistic activity and innovation, as well as other areas. People do things in speech, people do things in the classrooms. There's a lot of discussion among various scholars. This is kind of the hot topic for many languages and many language pedagogies. I brought you some articles, some references. Joy's non-binary French. There's all kinds of work that is being done, very exciting. Work on Russian is just beginning. There's a paper by Kirei Sitnikova, which came out earlier this year, but there's not a lot of work done. In a globalized context, and I will show you a little bit about this in the talk, non-binary linguistic innovations are often called pronouns, even when not just pronouns are meant, but the whole system of gender. In Russian, we will hear the word местоимение, pointing at English, or at least some kind of globalized context of English and other languages, as sources of the discourse or models for this discourse, since in English we often talk about pronouns when we talk about gender grammatical markings. This is an example of one of the videos that I'm going to be discussing, where the non-binary speaker is asked what grammatical gender they're using, and they say, если человек хочет меня унизить, if a person wants to humiliate me, то ему все равно, какие местоимения я использую, it doesn't matter what pronouns I use, pause, какой грамматический род я использую, what grammatical gender I use. So this language of pronouns, we'll see it again. By the way, I translate they in English for every non-binary speaker because I don't know what they prefer in English, only what they prefer in Russian. Okay. Questions and approaches. My questions: how do non-binary speakers talk about themselves in Russian at this moment? How do others react to them? And what can we learn from these reactions about how language functions in society? My approaches involve queer linguistics approaches, obviously variation as sociolinguistics of gender, and my own area of study, which is pragmatics, especially face work and identity construction in mediated context. I've published many articles in this area. and I'll show you a little bit of this. I'm very invested in queer methods. I recommend the book Imagining Queer Methods by Gaziani and Bryn, which is a wonderful recent text. They also published earlier discussions and articles, and they help us envision what queer methodologies across social sciences and humanities disciplines might look like. A part of this work is accounting for dynamic and fluid situations. So understanding that queer discourses and LGBTQA discourses, and specifically non-binary discourses, evolve over time. They're fluid and they're not final. They're not finalized, especially as language change is going on right now. So any data sets that we're working with are only snapshots. They're snapshots of particular moments and contexts, but they're also snapshots of particular curatorial choices. Who decides what, for example, a video will look like, who moderates interactions, and why are decisions being made the way they're being made. And queer methodologies are always evolving. I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. For this data set for this talk, I have focused on YouTube videos and publicly posted comments. YouTube videos are an established data set. YouTube videos and comments are an established data set in Pragmatics multi-participant research. So Lorenzo Dus and Blitvich and myself, we've all done this. Because of human subjects, it's not a human subjects data set. And it also helps with ethics for groups that might be persecuted for their speech, which presents a difficulty in case of Russia and Russian research into non-binary speakers because of the political situation. I searched for небинарные люди, and then I expanded my search for небинарный человек, небинарная persona, and I found quite a few videos uploaded, and I focused on those between 2020 and 2021. And I've analyzed 5 so far, and I've selected 2 to share with you today. And I ask the same questions of every video and every comment section. Are non-binary speakers present and speaking? Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's all experts. What expressions are used by non-binary speakers in the video? What expressions were used by the host commentators or questioners who are assumed not to be non-binary? And then I analyze the comments, I tabulate them, I code them, and I applied mixed methods methodology, mostly qualitative, with the tools of Pragmatics and Facework, but some of it is going to be quantified as well. The first video is this video called Небинарный человек. It features one speaker who is then asked questions. The non-binary speaker is Kai, who has in the last 2 years lived in Germany, and Kai uses оно, or средний род. And Kai explains it as «Я в русском языке использую средний род». I talk about myself in the neutral grammatical gender, and I want people to refer to me like this as well. One of the issues with using grammatical gender of оно is the discrepancy between a written and a spoken communication, because Russian has word final devoicing, and the speaker expresses it, that in the end of words, unstressed words, because of the word final devoicing, я сказала and я сказало is the same. So this has its advantages and disadvantages for the speaker, because on one hand, they have the inability to express themselves without being too visible. On the other hand, they're not being recognized as using non-binary gender means in speech. They do in writing. Interestingly, this is an example of when the speaker says, varies between neuter and feminine, and the auto transliteration, the auto captioning is not able to do it. So, поэтому, когда я говорю «я сказало», «я сказала», «я сказало», so 2 of them are neuter and 1 of them is feminine, and the auto transcription catches them all as feminine, which is, I think, a good illustration of exactly the problem that Kai is talking about. What expressions were used by hosts, commentators, and questioners who are probably not non-binary? Neuter grammatical gender was used in all community-sent questions displayed in the video. Questions from the community were sent through social media, and they all used neuter. And this might or might not reflect the curatorial process, where everything is selected on whether or not they used the form correctly, or maybe the forms are corrected. We don't know. Here's an example. Ты подумывало о том, чтобы сделать операцию по смене пола. Have you thought about neuter? having a surgery, a gender-affirming surgery. Okay. Then we go to comments. There's 295 comments to this video, and they're all really interesting. I don't have time to get into the exactly how it works, but this exchange is important to discuss. So this comment, the first comment, is supportive, but it misgenders the speakers. The speaker, as you can see, the comment uses both feminine and neuter interchangeably. Если родилась оно и сумела остаться самим собой, смелая личность, интересное солнышко, будь счастлива. So this is a mix of feminine and masculine. You have a translation there. And from the point of view of Facebook considerations of whether something is polite and impolite, this comment is super interesting because it is meant, we assume that it's meant as positive. However, it uses incorrect or inappropriate identity markers, which places it in the category of impoliteness. There is a reaction to this comment, the writer VP, who is parsing it as impolite towards the speaker and is reacting with a correction. If you want to refer to a non-binary person using the pronoun оно, do not write it in quotation marks. Please note the English forms of words. Use all the forms of verbs in the feminine. Это misgendering. This is misgendering. Again, this is a calc from English. Kai would say, and then we see the forms used. Родилось и сумело остаться самим собой. So this is not moderated. These are speakers who respond, and as you can see, they use the forms, or at least they attempt to use the forms. The second video that I want to discuss, I will only discuss one of the speakers in the video. There are 4 speakers who are non-binary. They live in Russia, all of them. Kai, Artur, Dasha, and Nyu. And they all use slightly different ways of expressing their gender. Kai uses plural, Artur uses masculine, Nyu uses both feminine and masculine, but in this video only uses feminine, and Dasha uses feminine. No other speakers or commentators were present. Description says, Kai говорит о себе они. So Kai refers to themselves using they. However, Kai does something much more interesting than using они. And as you can see, the pronoun они is displayed here in the video. Kai uses я, first person pronoun, singular pronoun I, with plural forms of verbs which do not mark for gender. Я осознали, I realized plural, свою небинарность после того, как увидели рекламу с небинарной моделью. I realized plural, I saw plural, тогда я поняли, then I understood. So all of it is in plural. All the verbs are in plural. We have 210 comments. A lot of them are of very negative, and they're negative specifically towards Kai, who is the most innovative. So speakers in Russian can do a variety of things to express their non-binary gender. They can do plural, they can do neuter, they can do masculine, they can do feminine, whether matching their assignment or not matching their assignment when we know their assignment, or if we even care about their assignment, and they can mix masculine and feminine. In writing, they can do other things as well. But the most negative reactions are aimed at the speaker who is using the most innovative form. I'm really interested in metalinguistic comments, which comment on the language, so I brought you some examples of that. They и они в английском и русском языках не используются одинаково. Kai only refers to themselves as они, only because misgendering, плохо учил английский, badly studied English. So these metalinguistic comments are frequent and they're important. So in the interest of time, here are some things that I want to say in terms of my analysis. There's a lot more data and I can discuss it in Q&A. Non-binary speakers have a multiplicity of means to express their identities through writing and speaking. Those do not always work the same way. The political situation affects whether and in what context non-binary people will be able to express their identities. This also has to be taken into account. These expressions are not always safe, and they do not feel safe. I expressions, this is kind of the big thing that I've discovered, that I expressions, so the first person reference and first person grammatical gender used by speakers, are key to the Russian linguistic situation and require further study. In English, when we use I expressions, we use the first person singular to talk about ourselves. We do not need to express our gender, and we do not need to commit to a gender when we speak about ourselves. This is not true for speakers of Russian. You commit to a gender when you choose a verb, and you can use a variety of avoidance strategies, how to avoid this commitment, but this is key to understanding the situation. The organizers, questionnaires, participants who are not non-binary, and curators often use gender avoidance strategies, which also I study and hopefully will publish about soon. They use plural, небинарные люди, or they use impersonal constructions, a variety of them, to not utilize, to not mark the speaker's gender. They can also use non-binary linguistic choices following non-binary speakers' example with a degree of faithfulness. They can do it, but they choose to mostly choose gender avoidance strategies. This too is really interesting to me. When we look at comments and reactions, we have a range of negative comments always that follow, they constitute a genre. They move according to what in pragmatics are called genre moves, which can be combined. There are comments about mental health and normalcy. There are comments about anxieties about heterosexuality and heteronormativity. There are comments about non-binary identities being demographically harmful to Russia. This often includes nationalist and racist statements. Comments about foreign interference as a motivator for LGBTQIA expression in general and for non-binary expression in particular. And there are the meta-linguistic comments which reflect anxieties around language. And then the range of positive comments can express solidarity, usually often using appropriate gender markers with no problem. What I call co-text, a text that expresses alignment with non-binary identities. Oh, great, I didn't know there's a word for this. This is my experience too, quite frequent. Correcting misgenderings and arguing with negative comments. And my conclusions, videos are mediated contexts in which voices of non-binary people can be heard, often combined or superseded, interestingly, by voices of experts. These videos can be sites of visibility and expression, solidarity and language change. They can be sites of globalization and action. They can be sites of othering and hegemony via commentary and expert opinion. The comments can be sites of conflict discourse, which contributes to processes of language change. They can reflect anxieties of a language which correlates with nationalist and heteronormative viewpoints. They can be sites of norming, othering, and hegemony, but also sites of solidarity, coalition building, and language change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renee, for that fascinating presentation. And I'll just make a few comments before opening up. The chat is open, actually. The Q&A is open, and your comments are welcome there. And we'd like to get your questions flowing from these presentations in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Both of these presentations, I think, show quite vividly how queer approaches to the study of our region, the study of Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, can help us to transform our understanding of these regions. In Anita's presentation, she makes the point, and it's a very important point, I think, that the work of queering history for our region is not merely one of a recuperative project of sort of rescuing ancestors, if you like, from obscurity, but also asking about how understanding previous iterations of queer expression and queer experience can illuminate the way queer lives are lived now, and in particular the way politics is lived now in the region. In Renee Perelmutter's presentation, we hear how non-binary people are taking agency and making the language their own, and in, I would say, really fascinating and complicated circumstances that are political, but that are also linguistic. And what Renee has done is show us just how complex those linguistic circumstances are and how different they are from one language to another. And so I'd like to pose a question to each of the speakers to set us off. The first is, I think, is going to be to Anita, and that's about her statement about the lack of archives. And I think really what you were speaking about there were community archives. Are there not ways that we can get around this apparent lack of archival data? And how have you found that possible in your research? So give us some hope that doing queer history in the region is possible. I mean, obviously, people are doing that, but tell us how you have wrestled with that dilemma. For Renee, I'd like to know more about their conception of pragmatics and queer methodology. I'd like to know more about what that entails, what that means, and perhaps if you could say something about how we could apply that in our research. I'd love to hear more about that. So just quick questions to kick us off, and I pass over to Anita first.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, so I think, there's also issues about institutional archives and, the politics of the archive, which again, it's not just the regional problem, the issue of coding sexuality and particularly non-normative sexualities, also always from the authorities' perspective. So in that sense, it of course offers a very top-down approach to these subjects without often the ability of hearing the voices from these communities. But in terms of getting around, I do think there are different ways. In terms of my own research as a historian, I think there has been a lot of ways in which reading into the silences, of course, again, these are not necessarily new ways of thinking about recovering and also inserting queerness into histories, but also in many ways rereading some of those novels and literature that would would lend themselves for a different reading than, historically speaking, mainstream interpretations would allow. And then, of course, in terms of specifically the archive, and I couldn't stress this enough, I wouldn't have been able to write the book without the help of an amazing archivist. So I think a key is actually to have wonderful archivists who then can either help you direct you to either publications or personal documents or individuals who have not, wanted or reposited their sources, but also kind of ways in which one could find queer voices and also treatments of non-normative sexualities in established state archives. So I think it's in terms of the hopes, I do think, and I want to again acknowledge the ongoing efforts and an amazing efforts despite the political situation, which I think we don't have to dwell on. Everyone who's tuned in probably is aware that is. And I mentioned some of the setting up of these queer transnational archives, actually East Central Europe, they are traveling. Also, there's a lot that is happening in the artistic community. And again, that's where some of the new ways in which we can reimagine of enacting and an artistic recreation of queer experiencing in the past, which I think, again, in terms of just following up Renee's idea of imagining queer methods, it's some of the new innovative methodologies that allow us to think about reinterpretation and inserting queer voices in the past, even if we don't have actual, hard copies of these voices and records. But I'll just stop here.
Thanks very much, Anita. Now, Renee.
Thanks, Anita. This is fascinating. I want to know more about all of those things. Okay, so pragmatics is a subdiscipline of linguistics that studies language and use, and specifically attends to how context helps us shape meaning, and how speakers parse meanings in interaction, and what goals they pursue in interaction, and how they achieve those goals. Pragmatics itself has many branches. One of them is interpersonal pragmatics, and within that, the paradigms of face work and politeness look at the good old Grice's paradigm of cooperation and dismantle them, or look at them, and not everybody's going to want to cooperate in discourse. Well, then what are they doing in discourse? Well, they're pursuing certain goals of positive face, wanting to belong, roughly, and negative face, wanting not to be impeded in one's actions, again, roughly. So how is that done in language? That's what pragmatics looks at, roughly. Okay, we don't have a lot of time to go into this in detail. Now, queering, and we do this pragmatics by attending to conversations, to discourses that happen conversation. These conversations and exchanges can happen through mediated context, so they can happen in face-to-face context. One of the biggest differences between face-to-face and online discourse is the number of participants that can converse simultaneously. In person, we often think about dyadic or two people together communication. It's hard to disrupt that because you can't just listen to 500 people at a time. Online, because the communication is asynchronous, there's time lapse between messages being posted, people can and do have multi-participant or even massive multi-participant conversations. And that changes the dynamic of how they do interaction and what goals they pursue in interaction. Does that like have some meaning? So I personally am very invested in multi-participant conversations because I feel that, and I've published about this, and others have as well, that multi-participant conversations don't work the same as conversations between two people. They're more complex and they do more complex things. Now, queer methods. The challenge of queer methods is endless, and as people who do queer studies across disciplines, we will not do them in the same way. I think though, when we think about commonalities and what queer linguistics contributes to this, is that we begin by questioning how power operates in our own research, what positionality and what access of power we bring. So if we are a person who collects data, how does that position us vis-a-vis the people that we collect the data from? And I think this especially is important in contexts where the speakers or the people that we're collecting data from are endangered because of their identities, because of political situations. So we must be attuned to our own positionalities and the kind of power that we hold and the kind of power that we maybe don't want to admit that we hold. This permeates social sciences research, and we need to be aware of it, as well as humanities research. Queer methods, one of the things that have been on my mind is that we need to reject unchanging and like solid state categories. So not every non-binary person will identify as transgender, for example. So if we only approach it as, okay, everybody is transgender, what are we obscuring by these categories? What are we revealing by those categories? So we need to be at home with uncertainty, and we need to be at home with dynamicism, both in our data and in our methodology. This, for me, also ties to rejecting binaries. In this book that I recommended by Gaziani and Bryn, they discuss how, and in other articles that they've published, they discuss how there's power in imposition of binaries. Is that a lot of times power operates through hierarchies, hegemonies of it must be male and female. Well, why? Who is telling you this? Or it must be this or this. This must be east and west, or whatever categories of the day are expressed through the binary. So we need to understand them and we need to reject them. Or at least we need to nuance them. We need to do something with them. For me, really, it's a lot of it for me is about how do I construct the data set? And what does my data set say? What am I looking at and what conclusions will I be able to draw from the data sets? If I just ask myself, oh, how do non-binary people talk on Twitter or they talk on YouTube, that's not going to give me, that's not going to delimit me in ways in which I can actually be attentive to, okay, this is contextual. In this context, they're going to do it one way. In another context, they're maybe going to do it another way. The comments are not just about how people feel, but they're also expressing identities. They're expressing group identities. They're reacting to political situations. So, for example, in Hungary and in Russia, so because of political regimes, resisting the regimes often can come through by vocal, voiced, or less vocal but voiced support of persecuted identities. And it's an identity statement for somebody to say, I'm an LGBTQI ally. What does it mean in practice is complicated, needs to be researched. So it's not just about, oh, I want to support non-binary people, I want to support LGBTQA people. This is about, oh, I really dislike this government, I have to oppose this government. This is the speech, the discourse that I'm going to contribute to this. So nuancing our methodologies and constantly thinking about how power hegemony operates in interactions, what are the interactional goals, what are the identity goals, and how can we research this? Like, what are the specific language means by which these things are expressed, are things that, for me, constitute my queer methodology.
I think it's fantastic to hear that elaborated and brought out in various ways. Of course, we all have to be at home with a certain amount of uncertainty and in order to do scholarship, in order to do research, but remembering to be that open to uncertainty and imprecision, and also thinking about our positionality. Now, there are many questions piling up in the Q&A. Thank you very much for these excellent and sometimes quite detailed questions. I'm going to go to questions for Renee, first of all. There are a couple of questions that relate to practice in the classroom, and I think this is probably an area that a lot of people in the audience are going to be asking themselves. So in a sense, these questions are about the language classroom and discussions in departments about how to introduce non-binary pronouns in Russian language classes, in beginner's Russian, and is it possible? How would you like to see this integrated into textbooks? That's another aspect of some of these questions. And also concerns about safety in the class and in the program more generally are part of this sort of cluster of questions. So if you'd like to comment on that. So introducing these in the language class, introducing in beginner's language class, discussions in the department about this, and then also safety in the program issues.
So I really appreciate those questions. As I think I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, I often get those questions often from GTAs as well as colleagues who want to accommodate their non-binary students. And I want just to preface to say that the safety issues are real. A lot of times students feel unsafe. They feel unsafe because of multiple reasons. But one of them is because the departments need to do the work of understanding how the students might feel unsafe if the department has not done the work of embracing queer pedagogies and embracing diverse pedagogies. This extends not just to non-binary students, but to students of a variety of identities traditionally marginalized by our fields. We have discussed a fair amount about race and how to, how do we contend with the fact that our discipline is not racially diverse. So these issues that are going together. It is not on the student to create safety in the classroom. This is on us as pedagogy experts, as professors, as instructors, as GTAs. And this is a conversation that we are having in the field. And I hope that we will continue having this conversation in the field, because students deserve to feel safe in our classrooms. Lack of safety might also come from other students. This is a dynamic that's a bit harder to negotiate, but also can be negotiated by modeling by professors what is respectful and what is not respectful in the classroom. So these are my views. I am not a prescriptivist in any way, shape, or form, but this is what I practice in my language, in my pedagogies. Whatever I teach, I practice inclusive teaching practices, and I'm happy to talk more about what that looks like and what work I am doing and have already done to move in that direction. As for what forms to use, Russian language is in flux. This is what my research shows, and this is what every research shows. This is in flux because Russian has been kind of a little bit behind the curve, both in terms of what the speakers do, the acceptability of what the speakers do in terms of political situation. This is a key role. It really plays a key role because speakers, if they're not feeling endangered, they will be more empowered to visibly innovate. So it's kind of going to happen a little bit sooner. But this is an area of change in the world. It is not stabilized in many languages. It is still ongoing. The work is still ongoing. However, in our field, the research is also a few steps behind. I have seen discussions in scholarly literatures about pedagogy that Russian research into incorporating not just non-binary speakers into textbooks, into the classroom, but also non-heterosexual relationships, portrayals of people, families of color, different family structures. All this is lagging behind pedagogies in other languages where we have this literature in French, in Spanish, in other languages. We have, colleagues have done and are continuing to do a lot of work. I've attended a few fascinating talks over the last few years, staged by the Berkeley Language Center, about different, different research and accommodations into pedagogy, and I'm happy to share some of the slides that I found really important for myself. Primarily on French, I think that's the talk I usually recommend, and I'm happy to share it. What students can do in the classroom and what endings can students adopt. As you have seen, there are many options, and none of them have become as mainstream as they have become in English. They is an established use. We have many other means in English to convey non-binary identities, including neopronouns, including binary pronouns, changing pronouns, but they has become the most recognizable use. This is not the same yet in Russian. We do not yet have a coalesced one preferred way. We have a multiplicity, and also these communities are very marginalized, and they are still constituting themselves in terms of speech, what means they're going to use. This creates a problem for learners, and it creates a problem for educators. My personal approach is to say, here are the means. We would like you to practice the paradigm. I don't actively teach Russian right now. I mostly teach linguistics courses and culture courses right now. But I recommend to say, these are the options. We'd like you to practice the paradigm. You can choose these options. You have a choice. So you can commit to one, but you can change just as long as you're consistently making a single choice. Now, some people would recommend, okay, choose masculine, feminine, or neuter, because that's gonna help you understand the paradigm, practice the paradigm, or even choose a masculine, feminine, but then you have freedom to choose it. You have freedom to choose a name in the class, which maybe does not only follow masculine or feminine forms. There are all kinds of non-binary names which are, people use right now. So does that help? So I think that while we cannot provide perfect answers, we can take multiple positive steps towards empowering our students to have agency and to have their identities recognized. One of the things that are important, I think, and this is the last thing that I'm going to say about this because I feel I'm going over time. One of the things that are important for queer methodologies is to question what teams are constituted and how teams are constituted. And as a non-binary queer person myself, as a multilingual speaker and as a linguist, I am not going to have the same insight into issues as a person with a different positionality. So again, I'm not saying that what I'm saying is prescriptive, because it is not. But I think when I think about what are my pedagogic goals, I want to empower students to have agency and to have their identities recognized. So I'm going to look for ways to accomplish those goals in, obviously, collaboration with the students themselves.
Great, thank you for that answer. And I don't think you went over time. There's an awful lot more that our audience want to hear about in this area. And if you'll indulge me, and if the audience will indulge me, I'm going to ask some more questions of Renee before I turn back to Anita. And I hope that's okay with Anita as well. Anita, put your camera on and tell me, and shake your head if you disagree. That's fine. Because I think the conversation is rolling here on these particular issues. And there are a set of questions about ani versus ano. So the plural, they, versus the singular neuter pronoun, and anxieties over the traditional use of ano only for inanimate subjects. This is really going back like 40 years to my study of Russian, so forgive me if I'm stuttering here. And also about verbal agreement with the use of ani. So, for example, Charlotte Dowling here asks, for instance, T. Действия posted 2 graphic guides based on personal experiences of using ani, and the speakers disagreed on some elements. For example, whether they prefer others to say ani делают or ani делает. I'm wondering if what you have found in your research supports this, and that there are indeed a lot of differences in use between different speakers, or if there is actually already a somewhat standard use of these innovations. So there's a set of questions around that. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll begin with ano, because this is kind of a bit easier, I think, to tackle. And I will start with about 4 or 5, we don't know how many thousand years ago, with Indo-European, from which both English and Russian are descended. In early Indo-European, we only had 2 genders. We had the animate gender and we had the inanimate gender. There is a lot more to say about this, but these are the rough overarching principles. At a certain point, and the inanimate gender resulted in средний род, and also resulted in the pronoun it and other expressions of neuter, which is why we hesitate to use средний род for people, because historically we don't think about it this way, even though it's not bulletproof in any way, and I will get to it in a moment. The animate gender at a certain point in late Proto-Indo-European has split into masculine and feminine, and thus engendered, and it happened because of phonetic catastrophe, phonological hiccup, if you wish. With phonological change, I can get into this, and you don't need to. But even having masculine and feminine in our languages has not always been that way. We would be perfectly all right if there was just the agent of gender in terms of inclusion, but there's not. Language changes. There are things that make ano easier, because it's already a paradigm that exists in the language. Users use it. There are many expressions and ways which are already in the language, which are used in средний род and in neuter to refer to people of any gender. For example, one of my comments that I brought for you calls the speaker solnышко. Well, we've seen this expression, no moje solnышко. Okay, this is neuter, and you have just used it towards a speaker of a gender who was not an object. It's possible, and there are even historical usages like this in folklore and other things that speaking about characters who are personified, like Солнце, which is a personage and is referred to in the neuter. So it's possible. Whether or not it's going to become the standard, I don't know. It's too early to know. Regarding the plural and the singular they, there is a lot of fluctuation right now. There are people who use ani with plural, and as you have just seen in the talk, there is also the option of the singular and the option of using ya with plural of the verb, and a lot of different variations. Moreover, complicating this is the fact that writing, such as on social media, is often a part of this picture because people communicate online through social media and other means. And some things are easier. For example, using ano is not ambiguous when you use it in writing, but it could be when you use it in speech because of the word final devoicing. I can't tell you that I have seen a solution emerge yet as the acceptable one. All that said is that I still need to figure out how I collect speech that is happening in real time. And that I don't know yet, because there's all kinds of issues, including with human subjects, about collecting this research and collecting this data and conducting this research. But when it will emerge, we will know, we will see it. I think that we will have to live with this anxiety for a while.
I just wonder, how will linguists know when Russian has got to the situation where one system has won out over others? What will be the standard? I know in French, for example, you have the Académie de la langue française to tell you what has happened with the language and where it is historically. Whether that may be a controversial statement, but
you can already see
but how will Russian speakers know?
Well, I don't think Academia or any such institutions are very helpful in this case, because they are hegemonic institutions. And so in every decision, we might ask ourselves, what is the reason they're approving or denying or ignoring facts of language change that have happened? And this is completely different from what speakers do in communities, I think. We will know because we will see increasing usages, and we will see, just like in English over the last many years, we have seen people, for example, we can do statistical searches over people's bios, and we will see the stages that people's bios undergo. And I can tell just one thing, right, of how do you search for this data. And I know that the person is about to come out as non-binary when bios that formerly featured a binary pronoun have suddenly no pronouns at all. And the next step, they're going to have a non-binary pronoun. So we have seen around the world the functions, how language change has percolated. And usually speakers say, please use this language for me. Please use these means for me. And having enough of those, for example, we form a data set and we count how many times a person has asked for this or that pronoun to be used, and then we see what has changed. A person over their lifetime in a situation of change and development in this particular area can go through a number of usages. A person who used "я делали" today can in 5 years use "я делало" or even something else. Right, and this is a part of processes that we see in other languages, and I think that we'll know through cumulative research. I mean, it's not a one person's endeavor. We will see it when we will have publications and we will have discourse and we will have practices, and we will be able to adapt as the language changes.
Thanks so very much. I think it really sounds like a fascinating area, and the questions from the audience have shown that. I have a transitional question here to move back toward Anita, but Renee, you may also wish to chip in. And it's this. It's about language. I appreciated very much the rich vocabulary you both used, and I wonder if you might comment on using gender non-normative or queer or non-binary instead of LGBT or LGBTQ. I'm also interested in the possible recuperation of the term gay. I'm not sure what the speaker has intended by that, but if you could comment on those linguistic choices in your talk. I might put this first to Anita, since she hasn't had a chance to speak for a little bit yet.
Thank you, but also Renee, I really, it's fascinating, and in a sense, I do appreciate the kind of importance to put Russianist in conversation with other languages, because I do think it's so, again, just being at the smaller liberal arts college and how the language departments are really revolutionizing the interdisciplinarity, and in not just querying languages, but also in terms of, for what I'm interested in is decentering Western Europe. But this question of terminology, I do struggle a lot with that, because I think that it's again, I think it's great. It's queer in a sense that it's fluid, right? These terminologies are fluid and people understand them differently. So I think, I mean, it might sound very anachronistic, but I think as long as people define what they mean, how they use them, I find I don't have a problem with these various different terminologies, even necessarily with gay. And I guess I imagine the person who asked us in English, because I think it has a very, very different meaning when we think about the languages that we are researching and studying, right? So in terms of you know, in Hungarian or in Russian, I think it's perhaps, given the context today, it's much more political what terminologies use. In terms of, I think in English, people have academic debates, and some people, particularly like in academia, have higher stakes invested in one terminology or not. But I think it's a whole nother playing field when you take it to lived experience in countries where just by owning these and using this term could get you killed. So I think for me that's something. But in terms of academic, as a historian, I like to use terms that my subjects used when I'm writing them. So I feel as a historian I need to honor those terms. But then as a general category, obviously I like to use terms like non-normative or queer, basically as umbrella terms that allows me that kind of flexibility that don't get me into that kind of identity politics that I find not useful in my own work. But I stopped there.
Okay, I think terminology, there's an anxiety over terminology. And I wonder if the anxiety over terminology is also anxiety about other things. So this is just, I'm throwing this out because it's something I struggle with as well. I use the term non-binary throughout for the speakers in my talk and for speakers that I'm studying, because what's relevant for this linguistic expression is that they identify as небинарные люди. They identify as non-binary. This is the language that the speakers use for themselves. I tend to use the language that the speakers use for themselves as the language in which I'm going to describe them. I use LGBTQIA+ as an umbrella term because I want to acknowledge that members, so non-binary people can have any sexuality, and non-binary people can also be intersex or not be intersex. These are not connected to whether or not somebody is non-binary, but can be a part of the story. I use the umbrella term LGBTQIA+ in order to be inclusive of the identities of people who might identify as non-binary as well. And I think that I like this acronym, but it's not perfect. And I like the acronyms that do not erase the letters I and A. And I'm going to continue using them until somebody presents me with an argument why I should move away from those and adopt something else, and then I might. So I don't know if it's very satisfying as an answer, but I do think that the word queer is hotly debated those days because we use it to describe theories and methodologies and work that we do as academics, and we use them to describe identities. But people nowadays, and also always, have all debates about whether or not they prefer or disprefer this term. So I expect that we will see some changes and some further conversations around the term queer in particular. I don't think I have much to say about reclaiming gay or how we might use the term gay, because that's really not, again, I don't know how much I can contribute to this, and but I'm really interested in the discourses which are happening and will happen around those terms.
Thank you, Renee. I'd like to say a word or two about gay and these terminological shifts. In that I feel in the period of my own sort of academic career and in the time since I began to learn Russian in the middle 1970s, that the language has shifted an enormous amount around me. I came out as a gay man in the 1970s in Canada, and gay then appeared to mean all of the things that are in the acronym LGBTQIA, and that we now know is not the case, and we prefer a different set of terms when we're writing. When I was doing my doctoral research in the 1990s, a certain set of terms were current then. I used the term transgender quite a lot in my first book about homosexual desire in revolutionary Russia. And that book tried to be open, I think, to gender variance and non-normative genders, but it was very much of its time, and it wasn't, I think, that intellectually committed to gender non-normativity as an object of research in itself. So I think the field is open for rereadings of that work that I did now almost 30 years ago on those issues. And certainly my readings of, say, what I call masculine lesbians or passing lesbians could be entirely reread as trans work. So I think that in the course of half a lifetime or a lifetime, the terminology changes. And the one thing that I think we can be sure of is that younger generations and new generations of queer people, let's just call them that, will come up with their own terms to describe themselves, and they will be innovative, and they will question some of the things that we have taken for granted in the terms we have. I think that's simply axiomatic, that this will happen, and that this will be an area where the terminology is shifting from generation to generation. I think one of the reasons for that is the fact that non-normative people, queer people, LGBTQI people grow up in often heterosexual families and don't get to meet their tribe or find their voices until later in life, and experience a coming to self-knowledge that is, in a sense, reinventing the wheel in each generation. And hopefully by speaking and doing queer research, we're moving away from that predicament where each queer generation has to establish itself from a standing start, as it were. I want to move to a question for Dr. Kurimay, and this is about current efforts to preserve queer life in Eastern Europe right now. So what are some of those current efforts to preserve queer history, queer life, queer culture in your region right now? thinking about how past archives have been destroyed and current gender studies programs are being dismantled, what are the ways that people are resisting these trends and trying to work against this aggressive nationalism?
I think, there's been a lot of, again, community-based, and it's similar, like, Renee's work in a sense. I think, along what you, Dan, said about this new generation, I think the online generation, and I think being social media is also allowed for a lot of community building across these various communities. I would say that the most, of course, there are actually historical archives who try to stay open. There are community-based, again, like the Háttér archive in Budapest has been open since 1995, and of course has been just in the heart and in center of course, a cultural war, if you want to say it, and in Budapest. But there are other very new, innovative ways in which people are imagining. I mentioned the work, Karol Radzievski's Queer Archives Institute in Warsaw, and it's also like a traveling exhibit. And there's something that, again, it's called Queer Budapest. It's just like my book, that it's going to open, I think, in Germany, that will be, an effort to essentially commemorate and also pay tribute to queer heritage, or for Eastern European or East Central European queers. But these efforts are really kind of organized by activists, and they find spaces often in outside of the region to showcase some of these some of the artistic, and often these are post 89 sources and representations, and basically commemorate places to actively build this and showcase the heritage that's part of the region's history, even despite the basically active erasure that is happening on the level of existing authorities of the region. So there's also the Valencia Iancu, who has in the archives in Bucharest, and the Art Museum of Romania, that also is similarly building and a base and often digitized sources that will allow future researchers to access, and also community members to actually donate. Because part of it is, of course, how do you encourage members to donate in a way that they feel that they're safe, right? They don't want to necessarily, not everyone wants to be seen. I mean, Renee mentioned that just the stakes that are placed, a lot of people are not comfortable being in public, let alone being identified as non-gender binary or trans or even just gay. That all of these terms are increasingly seen as almost illegitimate and close to be criminalized again. So in terms of these efforts are community driven and online, as well as ironically take place outside of the region in artistic form that are actually very active. And again, like I want to play tribute to the immense activism that still exists, and despite and I think many ways fueled by the state homophobia and transphobia that exist increasingly in the region. So I think there are actually archives being built, and also imaginative ways in which reimagining the past. I just listened to a presentation where queer artists were thinking about how to actually produce art that recaptures some of the past, and actually, in that way, creates this pre-existing yet non-existent heritage, and pay tribute to queers in the past. So I think they are, and I would be happy to provide specific sites and names if that would be helpful.
I think this whole area of artists serving as a kind of conduit for reactions against the homophobic and transphobic politics of the region is a really fascinating aspect of the cultures that are emerging in the region, and the ways that activists are finding channels for recovering voices and innovating to produce queer histories, to produce queer narratives in response to state repression. It's certainly one thing that's happening across all of the Eurasian region to varying degrees, but even in highly authoritarian countries like Kazakhstan, you have art projects that are resistant to heteronormativity, which is a really interesting feature of the region, that art is one of these spaces where people can still manage to make their voices heard. And also the fact of increased state and official repression is having, in a sense, the opposite effect that appears to be intended. The intended effect appears to be to try and shut people up. And in fact, what's happening is it's multiplying, perhaps even exponentially, queer discourses in many of the societies of this region. And Renee has demonstrated how that's proliferating online, but I think it's also proliferating in the space where art lives and works. So I have one other question here. It's a comment and a question. I'm going to just read it out for you. Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. I have a question for both Professor Kurimay and Professor Perelmutter. Professor Kurimay rightfully spoke about queering asses, while Professor Perelmutter dovetailed queer methodologies in the Slavic field. Both of you are purporting a paradigm shift in our field. How do you think this shift will actually happen in our field? Obviously, younger generations are exploring this arena, but what about established scholars, students, and disciplines that do not prioritize this work? Renee, would you like to come in on this?
Sure. Sure. I think that I don't see it as a paradigm shift. I don't see it as a paradigm shift. I see it as moving away from silences, because we are operating intersectionally. Area studies and study of Eastern and Central Europe is intersectional. In the Stock alone, we've seen history, we've seen linguistics, and there's literature, and there's film and media studies, and there's theater, and there's so many other disciplines. And these disciplines transcend area studies. And so when we go to conferences, which are disciplinary conferences rather than focusing on area studies, we see that the study of LGBTQIA broadly construed identities, art, histories, linguistic expression is the cutting edge, but also quite established across the fields. So in this way, our field is lagging behind. And it's lagging behind, I feel, because of silencing of certain topics and themes. And maybe even having scholars who are dealing with those topics, not finding the traction with their work that they find in more general fields and more general directions. This is what we should maybe try to correct. I do not speak as an insider because I moved out of the field, and I'll be very honest with this, and worked in general linguistics for many years, where I was not asked questions that I was, I moved, and now that I'm trying to return, I want to see a more inclusive field where conversations are going to happen. I think the idea of doing a whole essays about, queering essays, I'm excited about this. I don't know anything about this, but I'm excited about this. And I think that it's time for us to have these conversations as communities of scholars who work in the field and have research interests in the field. And I think that you'll find many established scholars with research interests in this direction as well. So I think the future can be bright and does not need to involve, completely changing everything, but just moving away from these silences, which are often political, and silences often are about power. So these questions are important for us to consider. Who benefits if we do not have these topics under discussion, right? What do the silences serve?
Yeah, I would also second these. I would just add a couple of things that, I think, yes, ACES is lagging behind in terms of a lot of the discussions, and I think it's not new. I think it's when can we have the conversation not just about sexuality, also still about gender and race. I think ACES have struggled to have these really transformational, real, honest conversations within the field that has, rocked some of the other fields. So I think that's one. But I think in a more practical sense, I think it starts basically in the classroom, and I think incorporating the things into the syllabi that we use, and teaching the next generation, and also reading works are being produced. I think we are, Renee and I are examples, but there's so many others. And of course, Daniel, the trailblazer, the forefather of the field, but there are amazing literature that actually exists already. So it's actually intentional. You want to kind of, the same way I think it's been a push to reimagine Europe from the margins and push, ACES and our region into the center of discussions. It's time that rather than political and the kind of established narratives that are still dominate. If you look at the programs of ACES and what kind of, approaches are being prioritized, you see that there's a lot to be said for rocking the field. And in fact, why don't we incorporate lens of gender and sexuality and even women's history, basic things that going back to the basics. I think it's there's just so many people, as you said, Renee, silenced, whose voices are heard and foregrounded. And in the classrooms where we teach, I think we have to think about how do we teach our region in terms of that ourselves. We make sure that for the next generation, I think both scholars and students are introduced to different ways of thinking about the region and the people. And so I think it starts in some ways really being conscious and aware of how do we assign our readings and how do we design our classes, the kinds of questions that we introduce. So I think it's not difficult. I think we'll get there. It's just we need to have these, start the conversation with being honest that we are not there yet, and we want to be there, and we need to be there for the sake of the field, but also the field of the practitioners as well.
Those are great sentiments, I think, to conclude on. And it sounds like it starts in the classroom and it will end in the conference hall at ASIS if we all pull together and work toward the querying of our field. I have to tell you about the forthcoming session, and here is a slide for our next session, which is on October the 29th, as you can see there at these times. And it is about imperial past in the present, affect, indigeneity, and memory. So again, we're looking at issues of intersectionality in focus. So please put that in your diaries, and thank our speakers for their inspiring talks today, and our audience for stimulating and exciting questions.